There's a question I get often from people that's kind of a loaded question because there are some misconceptions about separation. And I often have people ask me, when am I legally separated? Problem is, there's two different concepts that are tied up in that. The first is the concept of a legal separation as opposed to a divorce. It is possible under California law to go through virtually the same procedure as a divorce, but at the end, you're not divorced. You can get custody orders, you can get support orders, you can divide up property, but at the end, you're still married. This is called legal separation, and it's a box on the petition that you can check for either dissolution or for legal separation. There are some minor residential requirements that are different for both, but for all intents and purposes, they're the same process, the same procedures, but at the end, you're not divorced. A lot of people will file for a legal separation rather than a divorce for religious reasons or for health insurance reasons, because once you're divorced, you cannot carry an ex-spouse on your health insurance while you can carry a spouse. Now, there is another concept relating to divorces, which is your date of separation. And this is separate from a legal separation. At some point, if one of the spouses, that's either you or your spouse, decides, subjectively decides that the marriage is over and objectively acts as if the marriage is over, then that spouse has established a date of separation. This can be long before a divorce is actually filed. I've seen dates of separation years before divorces are actually filed, although that is not too common. Generally, when people separate and intend to divorce, they want to go through the process. This is a very important concept because it has implications in the division of property and for support purposes and for the length of the marriage. A marriage that lasts 10 years or longer is presumed under California law to be a long-term marriage. In a long-term marriage, the duration of spousal support is indefinite. You cannot terminate support, spousal support, in a dissolution judgment in a long-term marriage. If you have a short-term marriage, which is generally less than 10 years, then you can terminate support in the judgment, and a reasonable length of support in a short-term marriage is generally considered to be half the length of the marriage. Again, that's not the case in a long-term marriage. In a long-term marriage, it's indefinite, and the court can continue support even long in excess of half the length of the marriage, depending on circumstances in a long-term marriage. So that's one important aspect of the date of separation. Another is your income after the date of separation is your separate income. Your income prior to the date of separation is community income, and your spouse is entitled to half of it, or you are entitled to half of your spouse's income before the date of separation. The third main concept with regard to date of separation is in the division of property and the characterization of property. And this comes into play a lot with retirement accounts. So if you have a retirement account, any contributions made to your retirement account after separation are your separate property, and your spouse is not entitled to those. If you acquire any property after separation, then you don't fall in the statutory presumption of it being community property. And so you'll have an easier time proving your separate property for assets you acquire after separation. Now, if you acquire them with community property, then there's almost certainly going to be a community property interest in that, and that's going to have to be addressed during the litigation. So it is important to determine and establish what the date of separation is. One thing to really keep in mind, it's more difficult to establish a date of separation if the parties are still living together. It is virtually impossible to establish a date of separation if the parties are going through marriage counseling. That's something that the courts often look at as an indication that the parties are not yet separated. Also, if the parties have marital relations, sexual relations, then there can be a presumption that they are not yet separated. The final thing I want to touch on is if there is a dispute between an earlier date of separation and a later date of separation, the courts generally go with the later date of separation. Not always, but generally, and you can see this in the appellate cases that have been published in recent years. So if you want to establish an earlier date of separation, you should do it clearly. Make sure that you remove yourself from the family residence. You don't hold yourself out as husband and wife. You don't act like husband and wife. You don't have marital relations, and you separate things as much as possible so that there can be no dispute when the date of separation was.